Delamitri. My next guest has a day job lecturing in midwifery at the University of Dundee. Andrew Symon, welcome to the Culture Studio.
Thank you very much.
You've now made your fictional debut with a fantasy trilogy for children. But before we talk about that, I'm kind of fascinated by your own childhood. Give us a potted CV of the young Andrew.
A potted CV? Well, I was born in Athens. My parents come from Aberdeen and Inverness, but I was born in Athens and we moved to Tokyo when I was very wee, and then my father died and we moved to London, myself and my two sisters. So we were brought up in London, but Scotland was always home. Holidays were always in Scotland, so Scotland was home, and eventually, in good time, I moved back up.
Yes, and you didn't keep your Greek accent, clearly.
No, not the Japanese one.
And then you chose to be a nurse and a midwife, which, this was some time ago, this was in the 80s. That must have been kind of unusual for a guy to choose to be a midwife, clearly very happy with your own sexuality.
Yes, it's not an issue. It's still quite unusual for men to want to become midwives. But I was working in a hospital, a large maternity hospital in London, as a labour ward porter, and what I saw just fascinated me, and I thought, no, that's what I want to do.
Well, now you've written the Shian Quest Trilogy, which is a fantasy group of novels for children. So that's quite a departure from midwifery. How did this particular delivery come about?
It really grew out of children's story times. I have two boys who are now in their late teens, but bedtime stories were a feature every night. And it kind of grew out of that, with them learning how to use imagination and being allowed by one but not by the other to adapt stories, and then sort of the opportunity to think about, well, what happens if you change the ending, or if you change that character, or you put the word not in that sentence? Where can you go with that? And one son loved it and the other hated it, but it just kind of opened up that possibility that actually you can do an awful lot with this.
So you were catering for both tastes then?
Well,
yin and yang in this?
Yeah, a little bit, yes. I was writing it very much with them. They were my target audience, but it took a lot longer to write and to polish it to get it up to publishable standard. So they're way beyond the target age range of readers.
Well, what is the target age range?
Well, I thought it was 9 to 12, but actually we've had children, good readers of 8 reading it, and teenagers reading it, and quite a few adults saying, well, it just reminds them of the Scottish folklore stories that some of them grew up with, so they're finding a lot that they kind of tune into. So it's quite broad. It's children's, but up to teens, mid-teens perhaps, and adults as well.
The stories involve 12-year-old Jack Shian, who lives in Edinburgh, but he is no ordinary Scottish boy. Tell us about him.
Well, he's part of the family called the Sheehan. They're the otherworld people. Now, they've been around in Scotland, Scottish storytelling, the folklore tradition for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there was
they're like fairies, really, aren't they?
I've never used the F word in any of the stories, because I didn't want people to think, oh, this is about Tinkerbell. It's not about Tinkerbell. These are the otherworld creatures who are, well, they can look like any creature you've ever imagined, and lots that you probably haven't. So they're not garden sprites, the sort of Tinkerbell little lacewing flies that some people imagine fairies to be. So I've never used that particular word. They're other worlds. They can be kind, they can be menacing, they can be good, they can be evil. So there's a great play again here, with huge potential for the good clans and the bad clans, and their struggle for power and for treasure.
So describe what Jack looks like. Clearly quite macho.
No, he's not.
No,
I don't. No, he's not really. I think this is one of the issues, because he has to explore and find himself, because he's actually probably quite a shy lad, and the story is partly about his growth, about his journey, because it's a quest for treasure, for the lost Sheehan treasures, but it's also a quest for lost family, because he grows up with his aunt and uncle and his cousins, not quite knowing what happened to his parents, because separately they disappeared, but under mysterious circumstances years earlier when he was very wee, and so it's a quest for himself, for a personal family quest as well.
Well, maybe you would do us the honour of reading something from one of the books.
Yes, this is from the second book, and it's one of the examples where I've got the Sheehan and the human spaces intersecting for a while. Most of the stories are contained within the Sheehan spaces, but some bits they intersect with the human spaces, and this is one of them. They reached the Finisterre within a few minutes and were relieved to see Freya standing outside, where tourists and locals milled around. Jack and the others edged nervously through the human crowd to where Freya was standing, a nonchalant look on her face. "We thought you'd forgotten about us," said Lizzie. "The players will be ready to start soon." "I said you'd get you in, didn't I?" Freya was playing it cool. "How then?" asked Jack. He remembered how Philippe had taken him into the town hall in Claville, but that had been up a dimly lit side street with no one nearby. This was the Edinburgh High Street with dozens of humans all around. "Nobody sees what they don't expect to see," said Freya. "They're looking out for young people trying to get in the pubs. You can't just walk in. We use the Sheehan door. Just copy me." Freya walked up to the side wall of the Finisterre, just next to one of the windows that looked onto the high street. A small crowd of human women stood there shivering. All wore identical T-shirts with "End of the Road" on the back and "Tina's Last Fling" on the front. One of them had a large red L stuck to her back. Glancing both ways to ensure the others could see what she was doing, Freya placed her right hand on a part of the stone wall that was more worn than the surrounding area and leant forward. Ephatha! In a fraction of a second, Freya had fallen through the wall. Tina, with the L on her back, blinked and looked uncertainly at the remaining youngsters. "That's it!" exclaimed Jack incredulously. "The same charm we used to get into the square?" "You have to know where the keystone is," pointed out Petrus, but he was just as surprised as Jack. They each quickly followed Freya's example, one by one falling through the wall. Tina blinked twice and swayed. "I've had enough," she hiccuped to her friends. "Put me to bed."
I'd like you to have read me bedtime stories when I was growing up. Is that when Jack Shian did come into your head? Was that, when you were doing the stories for your kids, is that how he evolved?
He evolved over a number of years, I think. And I started reading more folklore tradition stories, and then I started to play around with the possibility that these creatures and people who'd been around for hundreds of years in Scottish storytelling but fell out about 50 years ago. I thought they can't really have gone away altogether. I'll bring them out of the cupboard and see what they're doing now. And I used the return of the Stone of Destiny as the catalyst for that, because that's what gives them energy. They reawoke when the Destiny Stone came back up to Scotland. So it's in Edinburgh Castle, and the Sheehan around Edinburgh became energised again. So suddenly they're popping out again, whereas they've been very quiet for a number of years.
Well, you'd have thought with this, there is an enormous appetite for fantasy fiction at the moment. I'm rather surprised, in fact, that there isn't more Scottish folklore around.
Well, there are some stories around, but in the sense they fell out of fashion for a little while. I mean, nowadays, with Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, of course, the appetite for fantasy fiction is enormous, but none with a particularly Scottish backdrop. And there is such a rich folklore tradition in Scotland that it seems surprising that there wasn't more of a Scottish presence in contemporary literature.
Well, budding authors, listen to that one. You have written academic books until now, Andrew. Have you found that writing for a younger audience is any easier, or does it pose more complex challenges than you might have imagined?
Well, it's both easier and harder in a way. It's a different style of writing, but they're complementary, because the writing and polishing is the same for both, that you write a draft and then you have to rework it and redraft and refine it. But the imagination that you're allowed when you're writing fiction, especially fantasy fiction, as long as the story is coherent, in a sense there are no boundaries, there are no rules that say you can't do that. So you can have people do more or less what you like. So that's very liberating, and that's great fun, just to give your imagination free rein and say, well, okay, let's see where we can go with this.
Well, stay with us, Andrew, while we have some music. I want to know more about your other lives beside midwifery and fantasy fiction. Here's the new song from Kylie Minogue. Go from Kylie. In the Culture Studio is author Andrew Symon, who's published the Shian Quest Trilogy, fantasy fiction for children, which is filled with adventure and mischief and magic. Your own sons, they, I'm assuming, read the first drafts, did they?
They did, yes.
Did they make any suggestions?
Yes, my oldest son, I asked him what he thought of it. He said, "Oh, it was all right,h," which is...
That's a superlative.
That's a great compliment from a 12-year-old boy. But he said, needs more bloodshed. So I thought, well, I'm not really into gore, but there is a battle at the end of the first scene, and so I beefed that up a bit. But it's not a slash fest or anything like that.
You've written 2 books. Is the third book on its way?
The third one's written. In fact, that's scheduled for publication in August this year.
So people don't have to wait too long.
No.
But is that part of the plan, that you do want people to be waiting, and they're going to be camping in the streets outside the bookshops, like they did with J.K. Rowling?
That's a lovely thought, yes.
I remember my own kids doing that. When you're not lecturing and writing fantasy, you are, I believe, a keen member of the Tartan Army.
Yes, that's things are looking up. It's been a fairly dire time for a wee while. But
how dedicated are you?
Oh, well, I've been all over Europe, and the furthest I got was Tokyo for a game, so that was great fun. So I've travelled quite a bit with the Tartan Army. It's great fun.
And what do you do? I mean, are you in the pub with everybody else, or no?
Oh yes, it's a lot of sightseeing and chatting with locals. It's great fun.
But I've heard that you're the unofficial padre.
Yes, that's mostly tongue-in-cheek. We worked out that when Scottish regiments go abroad, if they're in Germany or Cyprus or anywhere, they always have a chaplain with the regiment. And I thought, well, the Tartan Army troops are no different, really. They need to have someone looking out for their spiritual welfare. So I thought there's a need for that. So I kind of nominated myself for that role. It's mostly tongue-in-cheek.
But you're also a street pastorate in Perth. What does that entail?
Street pastoring is a local church initiative that's all over UK. It's across Europe now, and it's going to America and Australia, I believe. And it's local church volunteers walk the streets on a Saturday night from 10 p.m. till about 3 or 4 Sunday morning, and just making sure that people are okay. So it's really just looking, and eyes and ears on the street, making sure people are all right, just giving people a chance to talk. There's a lot of lonely people. There's a lot of people who've anxieties and fears, and sometimes they find it very difficult to voice these, even with their friends and family. And sometimes it's just a shoulder to cry on, or an ear to bend, or just helping someone to a taxi. I was on Saturday night and helping folk around and just make sure they get into a taxi, try to be sure they're safe.
So clearly you've got a Christian commitment here. I am wondering if there's any sort of comparison then between you and C.S. Lewis, who of course wrote the Narnia Chronicles, which were parables in some ways.
They're great stories, and I've read them, and I've been influenced by them inevitably because they're such wonderful fantasy tales. There's a strange coincidence, actually. My father was taught by C.S. Lewis, and even just today I came across a sketch that my father, who was a very gifted sketcher, he'd actually made of C.S. Lewis, which my sister, who's an illustrator, uses on her website. So it's interesting. Yes, there are some parallels there, because it was understated. He didn't make it absolutely obvious. It's allegorical, so you're not trying to beat people over the head with things, but trying to put clues down there, and people will work out the clues, I think.
Well, I knew nothing about that. What a coincidence that is. Andrew Symon, thank you very much indeed. The Shian Quest Trilogy is published by Black and White Publishing. The first book, Jack Shian and the King's Chalice, was released last year. And the second, Jack Shian and the Mapa Mundi, was published last week. And as we heard, the third one is coming up in August. After the news, I'll speak to